Nigeria's Land Use Act turns 45 years old today. The Land Use Act of 1978 was promulgated by General Olusegun Obasanjo's regime on the 29th of March 1978. The decree was made part of the Nigerian constitution before the handover to the civilian government of Alhaji Shehu Shagari and therefore became an act. Joining us to reflect on the Act 45 years later is Abayomi Fawehinmi, who's an entrepreneur, human resources professional. Thank you so much for joining us. Good morning to you. Yes, in your time zone. Good afternoon here. Can you reflect on the significance of the Land Use Act 45 years later?
Okay, Tracy, thanks for having me. It's been an interesting journey. If we look at 1978, when the law was passed by the military, by General Olusegun Obasanjo, what he did, interestingly, was that in 1979, when the 1979 Constitution was going to be written, he ensured the Land Use Act was part of the 1979 Constitution. And we ran it in the last 45 years. What has happened is that between then and now, the intendment of the law has not been achieved. One of the intendments of the laws written in the preamble of the law is that they want land to be available to everyone. Today, based on the last record we have from the Surveyor General of the country, less than 3% of Nigeria is titled. Quite a number of assets are kept as dead capital. If you are familiar with the works of the Soto, using the experience in Peru to show that what is the problem in most developing countries, that there is a lot of land, but the land is not titled. And because the land is not land, it is dead capital. What has also happened is that governors have make this law to become their fortress to ensure that they don't make land available to people at affordable rates. Today, faster in Nigeria to get land from the informal market than from the formal market, because the governors have decided to use these laws to the advantage of the elite and the rich people, as against the intendment of the Land Use Act, which says land should be held in trust for everybody. The governors are not holding land in trust for people. Interesting, and maybe this one you may relate with it. A couple of weeks back, when we had problems with Naira crunch, many governors threatened to revoke the seal of war of people because the banks did not make land currency Naira available. That is illegality. A governor cannot revoke a land of occupancy because a bank refused to collect old notes. But that's what governors have done. A couple of years back, a governor in South Nigeria said because the primaries of an election was held in an hotel in Port Harcourt, it was going to revoke their right of occupancy. So governors have decided to use the law to oppress, to terrorize, and to ensure land is not available to Nigerians. So the four intendments of the land use as stated in the law has not been met 45 years after.
Thanks, Prof. I guess, how would you assess the impact that the Act has had on businesses, particularly, I guess, maybe in real estate?
Oh, great. I mean, so there are many parts of it. Remember that for most people, the biggest capital you will have in your life is likely going to be on land. And by land, I mean land and building, based on the legal principle that whatever is affixed to land is part of land. So that is going to be your biggest asset base. Now, the problem is that if you have land, but the land, because of the land use decree, does not have a title, that land does not exist in real terms. When they talk about de facto and de jure presence in terms of holding land. So let's say, for example, now this is you, Rotos, you inherited a piece of land from your parents, for example, you got a piece of land, and the land does not have title. As a businessman, you can't use that land to go and get a loan from a bank. Now, that's the first problem you have. Many Nigerian businessmen say they have problems of capital, access to capital, that banks don't give them loans. But these guys have land. They have land in their villages. But the problem is that the land does not have title. So land is a physical thing. But in the modern economy, land is real when it has title. So what happens is that because you don't have title to the land, you can't use this land to go and get a loan from the bank. And so the first thing is that it stifles the opportunity for people to access bank finances from the formal sector, because land collateral is one of the ways for you to be able to do that. That's one part of it. The other part of it is it also reduces the quality of the balance sheet assets of the organization. So, for example, if you have a piece of land in Victoria Island and you value it, it boosts your balance sheet if you have to prepare your papers as part of your annual report. But if that land does not have papers on it, like if it doesn't have title, governors are not giving out title, the value of the land in some areas reduces by close to 20 to 25%. So That's 20-25% of your balance sheet being reduced just because a governor refused to sign the certificate of occupancy. We had a case in Lagos State where we had a governor who decided not to sign the certificate of occupancy for 3 years in a row. Not one single C of O was signed. But we also had those situations where governors were signing on a monthly basis. So it reduces your balance sheet, it affects your access to funds, and finally, it also determines how prominent you can become in the scheme of things. Because at the end of the day, if something happens in Nigeria today and one of your staff gets arrested, most likely if you want to go and stand surety, most likely the judge will say they want somebody that have landed property and a C of O in the town. If you don't have it, your friend will sleep in cell that night because you cannot be a surety to him. So in those 3 dimensions, at a minimum, the law and the operations of the law has a negative effect on businesses generally in Nigeria.
Thanks, Prof. Very, very informative. Very recently, President Buhari made signing some amendments that allowed states independence on electricity to generate and distribute electricity. Why do you think he didn't touch the Land Use Act? Is there more required there beyond the president?
Okay, so I mean, many Nigerians, and I'm sure you're also excited about the fact that the president signed the law that allows states to generate electricity, which is very, very good. But the law also allows states to provide water supply, but only 5.4% of Lagosians have access to pipe-borne water. So that he signed the law does not mean the governors do anything. The governor of Lagos State has right to provide water for all Lagosians, but only 5.4% have access to pipe-borne water today. So I'm not too excited with the law being signed, but that's my own personal opinion. Now, why will the Land Use Act not be reviewed? Because the governors don't want it to be reviewed. Actually, there have been attempts to review the Land Use Act over 5 times that has been documented. But at every point, the governors always resisted. You remember, one thing that General Olusegun Obasanjo did in 1979 was to ensure it became part of the Constitution. What that means is that in that republic, for you to review the Land Use Act, 24 2/3 of the House of Assemblies will need to sign. In 1999, when a new constitution was going to be done, the governors insisted that it was still forced to be part of our 1999 constitution. The problem with the Land Use Act review is that the president can't just sign it like he did in the last time. 24 houses of assemblies need to accept that. And what has happened at every point is that when the National Assembly has tried, has tried to review this law, what has always happened is that the houses of assembly don't agree. So it is the governors that have refused to enable the review of the Land Use Act. And my own view, and what I've said, I mean, many followers have been invited to talk about this subject, is that, you see, there's no need to review the Land Use Act yet. The only thing we need to do is to take the Land Use Act from the Constitution. Now, you need 24 houses of assembly to support that. Now, when you take the Land Use Act from the Constitution, it becomes a standalone law. And in that case, it is easier to amend. It's strange that the land tenure system, to the level of details and granular details in land use, is part of the Nigerian Constitution. It doesn't happen in many other countries, right? It's just a law that should exist as a law, not as part of the Constitution. But as long as the governors have seen it, we had a governor in Lagos State that said land to Lagos is like oil is to River State. And therefore, you have a situation where those land will be, the governors will want to do their best to ensure the land is not available to people, and they want to stay on the Land Use Act. And what is very interesting is that one of those governors is the president-elect today. So I'm asking myself, in the next 4 years, will there likely be a review? I don't think so. Based on his precedents and his successors' contributions to the debate about the review of the Land Use Act, it's obvious the president-elect and the people around him do not believe that the Land Use Act will ever be reviewed. And I feel that we'll keep land stifled for a longer period because of the characters of the governors in terms of wanting to use the law to hold people to pay a lot of money for them to get consent and things like that.
So has the private sector basically, in Nigeria, simply learned to live with the act, and can there be any pushback in terms of trying to get government to review it?
It's interesting. Your question is a very hard question. The private sector is always sometimes very funny. So the private sector went around this current administration going out and signed and initiated a couple of ideas and made them sign what they call the Omnibus Bill. If you remember that bill that reviewed the national housing policy, that reviewed industrial tracing fund. The private sector goes around those laws and ask, and they're able to influence governments to be able to review those laws. But you know, the funniest thing is that the law that is you are standing on, the law that determines your right to what you are standing on, you are not talking about it, right? I mean, it's important to review the ITF Act. It's important to review Education Trust Fund. It's important to review that. But the law that determines one, where you will sleep tonight, the law that determines where you will be buried, right? The law that determines whether your children will be paupers or not is the Land Use Act. The private sector has not shown enough commitment to get it reviewed. And that's why it seems as if it's only the governor resisting it. So you have a resistance in the governors, but you don't have that. So it's like you have a resistance from governors, and the private sector is more interested in reviewing CAMA, reviewing ITF law, and then citizens are more excited about review of laws related to electricity and all of those things. But the land that will determine whether your children will be rich, the land that will determine whether your parents will have a place to sleep or where you even be buried, we're living the way it is. So the private sector has folded is that. Now, what has also happened in the private sector is that some banks have also gone around the requirements of land consents. I know there's a plethora of cases where banks have won their figures doing that. So I think the private sector has not really taken this Land Use Act issue very seriously, and we're all the losers for it.
Well, so okay, so that means just final question for you is that if it is taken more seriously, it is possible that it can be pushed forward and we can attempt to get a review somewhere down the line.
Oh yes, I mean, it's possible to can get a review. I mean, we can't do without a review. I mean, this is a law made 45 years ago. Not one comma has changed in 45 years. I mean, that's perhaps one of the laws that have stayed the longest without any attempt for without any success in reviewing it. So we will have to review it. But the question is that, do we have enough interest driven by the private sector for it to be reviewed? Because the biggest losers from the Land Use Act are the individuals, are Nigerians, are workers, are people like me and you and the private sector. The public sector, particularly the state, wants it the way it is. The federal government doesn't want it the way it is because the Land Use Decree gives powers to the governor, not to the Minister for Works. So the governors will sit on it, but are we that committed and determined to change it? Because at the end of the day, if we keep this law for the next 45 years, what will happen is that you're using a 45-year-old law to deal with current realities. And today, you're having people talking about policies around assets increase, around assets mergers, trying to use crypto. You know, in some countries, blockchain has become one of the tools they use for land management. You will struggle to do that in Nigeria because the law has become an albatross to you at the end of the day. So we will have to do it, but are we really committed to doing it? And except we do it, our lands will remain dead assets, and we'll not be able to convert this dead asset into live asset just because we don't have enough securitization of our land.
Abayomi Fawehinmi, human resources professional, author, also entrepreneur. Thank you so much for talking to us about the Land Use Act. Very, very important conversation.